everyone, this is Mitchie, and welcome back to the Manic Manor podcast, and specifically, welcome to a segment on the podcast that I will call Haunted Tennessee. In this segment, we are going to be exploring the haunted areas in my home state, and first up on this list is Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. Now, this is one of the most notable haunted locations to come out of East Tennessee as of late, and it is an abandoned prison. Going back to the very beginning, it opened in 1896, and Brushy Mountain was one of the maximum security prisons in Tennessee. It was also a coal mine for the state that began in the wake of a labor battle when the Civil War ended, and the railroad had this big boom and a massive extension going on, and there was a demand for coal throughout the state of Tennessee, so that's where the start of this began. Now, the majority of mines were in remote locations, so company towns began to pop up, and miner wages were being garnished for things like rent and food and supplies. And while they were garnishing the wages of these miners, it was genuinely very inflated. So these people were pretty much working essentially on free labor because all of their money was being taken. And while these miners did strike for their rights, a new convict lease program soon was established, which gave companies a cheaper and way less combative workforce. So they were taking prisoners and using them for labor. Now, the prison lease system was adopted in the South due to the state being unable to maintain prisons or properly feed the prisoners. These programs leased out the inmates to these companies that were doing the coal mines for a fraction of the cost that the companies paid these original miners. It was a win-win for the companies, and it was a way to get around the 13th Amendment. They were exploiting it. While slavery was indeed abolished around this time, there was nothing about involuntary servitude, about criminal imprisonment that was ever stated in that amendment. Now, the state would loan out the prisoners around 1866, with the Tennessee coal mine located in Anderson County, north of where I live. They took up that practice in 1891. This would cause a major dispute that would come to be known as the Coal Creek War, in which the citizen miners attacked and burned down the mines and prison. They sent the prisoners and the guards out of town on trains, but the mining company sent them back along with troops. This would be a back and forth that would go on for months until the state constructed the very first maximum security prison, which is what we now know as the Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. Now, established in 1896, the original prison was wooden in structure, later constructed into like a castle-like build that we know today, and was made through prison labor. Conditions inside the facility were very lackluster. Disease ran rampant, primarily syphilis, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and a lot of other issues plagued the prison. These prisoners did not receive adequate care either and were routinely beaten because they were not producing enough product in the mines. And because of this, whether being beaten or whether just being overworked in the mines, this led to many deaths, as you can assume. It's ironic the amount of deaths that happened at Brushy Mountain, roughly estimated to be about 10,000 over the entire history, when there was actually never a death row that was set up in this prison. Now, when the building was still wooden, just one slip up away from a fire disaster in the 1930s, the prison held nearly 1,000 inmates, which was way more than it was meant to house. There was a major overcrowding issue, and it was so horrible that it worsened the conditions inside the prison. It was so bad that comparisons were made comparing Brushy Mountain to Soviet gulags, actually. This is when plans were made to build a new prison, standing about 4 stories tall, surrounded by a stone wall. It worked for a short period to combat the issues of overcrowding, but they just kind of pretended like it was this, gigantic thing that was going to help the prisoners. They thought that it was going to be more sanitary, it was going to offer redemption, but it wasn't the case. By the 60s, minimum security inmates were now being transferred into the system, while the mining was still the sole job for all these prisoners at Brushy Mountain. And with these new inmates, they were given jobs serving the community, such as serving at the fire stations around the area 24/7. Brushy Mountain, by this time, became the last stop of redemption for prisoners, quote unquote, meaning that if you continued to commit crimes from within any prison that you were originally stationed, you were going to be sent there. So it was kind of the last stop. Now, the worst of the worst in this prison were sent to D Block, which was built on the site of what the prison called the Old Death House. This is where bodies of prisoners who died in the prison and the mines were dumped until they could be claimed by families or buried in pauper cemeteries if their bodies continued to go on unclaimed. The mining jobs continued until a man by the name of Lake Russell, who was a warden, stopped doing the mining jobs. The mining at this time became a money loser. I think around this time, coal was on its way out as a way to power around the area. So it was more of a business choice than a moral choice. They didn't really give a shit about whether or not it was affecting the health and well-being of the prisoners. They just decided, we're not making a profit. The history of Brushy Mountain continued down a dark path as well in the 1970s. We look at the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. The murderer himself, James Earl Ray, was transported to this prison. He tried to escape and ended up getting stabbed, which resulted in him being captured again. The guards, who were angry about this whole situation, went on strike and demanded improvements in their working habits. This led to a complete shutdown of the prison for 4 years until the prison reopened again in 1976. Things were still tense when they reopened within the walls. Hatred was boiling between white and black inmates. There was a lot of racism. The black prisoners would complain that they would hear the white inmates multiple nights trying to saw at the bars in the prison to get to them and cause them harm. And eventually there was one white gang that would succeed in breaking their way through the bars and getting to these black prisoners. They held guards hostage at knife point, stole guns, and actually opened fire on other inmates, and they ended up killing like 2 of them. Now, the prison itself, on top of the events that I just mentioned, housed many other horrific events and people over the years, and would continue to do so until June 11th of 2009, when a combination of factors would lead to a complete cease of operations. Those are being, 1, the prison was way too expensive to maintain and upgrade. 2, it was too small to house inmates, and the Morgan County Correctional Institute had been formed nearby. And 3, the mining industry was all but dead and buried, and the need for the prison was at this point non-existent. So at that point, all the prisoners were transferred, functions were shut down. The place laid in abandonment until it reopened to the public for tourism in 2018. And people who tour the prison claim that they feel like they're either being shoved, they're being touched, they hear like growling noises, and there are some people who swear up and down that they've actually been scratched by something that is in the building. Now, when it comes to haunted places, and the greater the tragedy, the greater the suffering in life, the worse the haunt in the afterlife is what people know. Brushy Mountain was the end of the line for many prisoners, and there were many prisoners that saw the end of their life in these walls, as well as guards as well, I am sure. It's natural to assume that spirits of those who were condemned to end their existence in these walls would stick around and probably be a little bit pissed off at how things turned out for them. There was an attorney who visited Brushy Mountain, and that attorney, quoting, likened it to the mouth of hell. The people who visit talk about having this eerie feeling, almost as if they shouldn't be there. And I mean, if you look at the building itself, it's slowly decomposing, it's gray, it's depressing, it gives off depending on the weather in Tennessee, kind of this Silent Hill vibe when you look at it, especially from pictures. If you don't live in this area, it's very horrific just looking at it. Kind of gives you this uncanny valley feeling from time to time. So, my question here is, do you believe that Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary is more than just an abandoned building? Do you think that it's actually haunted? Or do you think that people are just living up to the hype of the history that is surrounding it? If you want to, you can see for yourself. You can go online and book a public or a private tour. As of this episode that I'm recording, they are closed for the winter, but they will be reopening their doors in April of 2025. So why don't you take a step towards the end of the line yourself and see what it's all about? I'd like to thank you guys for listening to the first episode of the Haunted Tennessee series. If you have any other comments that you would like to add in or anything that needs to be corrected in this episode, please feel free to let me know. You can reach out at manicmanorpodcast@gmail.com. You can also reach out on Facebook and Instagram at Manic Manor Podcast. And if you feel so inclined, take a step towards Patreon and give some support. Not necessary. I will continue to do episodes whenever I possibly can. But until then, I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I will see you in the next episode.